Hi, back again. So, welcome to Photo History 1. We're going to talk today about the 1930s in America and how photography took a really forward look at the Depression in America, quite frankly. And after the stock market crash in 1922, the country was left in various disarray. And so photographers had a lot of work to do, and that's what we'll focus on. Particularly in a group called the FSA, and the FSA was part of what was called the historical section. So the government under Roosevelt created all these different sort of departments that would do work to help and give people jobs. So this was created to show what was going on in the country, but it also gave these photographers work. It was headed by Roy Stryker, who's shown here on the left, and one of the first photographers on his staff was Arthur Rothstein, who's shown on the right. And this documentation was the work of 11 photographers. So Arthur Rothstein, Theo Jung, Ben Shawn, Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, Carl Meidens, Russell Lee, Marion Post Walcott, Jack Delano, John Vashon, and John Collier. And those are listed in order of hire. And they were sent out to the country, and they were given shooting scripts to follow. And I'm not going to read all of this, but it was Stryker's sort of idea of what you should look for, and it would be to show different income levels and to show what men's spaces look like and what women's world looks like, and to show the relationship of people on and off work and how do people look, decorations in people's home. So since Arthur Rothstein was one of the first hires, he was sent to the South and out west, and he made this photograph, which was pretty interesting, called Fleeing a Dust Storm, Cimarron County, Oklahoma. And it shows the drought conditions that were going on. So the drought conditions that were going on in America were sort of caused by people themselves because they had over-farmed with single crops. And by doing that, the earth never became refurbished or replenished. And so it kind of came about because of this whole drought idea, but it still existed, and people had to deal with it one way or the other, and it was very difficult and dangerous to have all this dust in the air. People had respiratory ailments as a result of this. Arthur Rothstein got into trouble for this photograph because he moved the skull. So he found the skull, but evidently where he found the skull, it didn't have quite the same pictorial effect as by moving it and positioning it in a certain way, maybe on this really craggy, dry ground, which showed the evidence of the drought. So he got into a little trouble when this was exposed, that he had done this. So then we'll move on to someone who is a little bit more well-known, and Walker Evans. He was employed with the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, for about 2 years, 1934 to 36. And when we think about Walker Evans, we can think of his style as being distant and cool and sort of architectonic. And think of it as sort of an American vernacular. He really was interested in that everyday documentation. So here he is, a self-portrait, early selfie, and then this photo booth that was taken in New York City. So Walker Evans grew up in St. Louis, and his family moved at one time to a North Shore Chicago suburb. His dad was in advertising, and he arrived in New York after attending several colleges and 1 year in Paris. And when he was in Paris is when he actually learned how to take some photographs. He was very inspired by Paul Strand's Blind. And he was at the New York Public Library, and he was thumbing through camera work where Paul Strand's Blind woman was shown, and he remarked, "That's the stuff, that's the thing to do." So he knew that that was what was going to be his sort of inspiration. So we'll take a look at some of the things. He collaborated with a number of authors. Well, he had this sort of literary interest, so he did. He seemed to make friends with literary types, and so here he was commissioned by this man named Hart Crane, who wrote the novel *The Bridge*, and so one of the photographs of the bridge appeared on the cover of a trendy literary magazine called USA, and but he made this interesting view of Brooklyn Bridge, and most of us have seen Brooklyn Bridge from the top, not underneath. So this is kind of unique. It's very abstract. It's a new way of presenting what you see, what the image is. So he would go around and photograph, make interesting images of the day. Here we have a wonderful woman in a cloche hat and kind of very sort of deco look. Girl in Fulton Street, New York, 1934. For another man, he illustrated The Crime of Cuba. This was for the book by Carlton Beals, and so he went down to Havana, and he made 31 of his photographs ended up being in the book. So we see things like this interesting gentleman in a white suit that's so, I don't know, so elegant. But it's got the signature things about that Walker Evans does, and I'm going to go to this one for a minute so you can see it better. So you see the Coca-Cola sign. He loves Coca-Cola, I believe. And then you've got the magazines, and there's two men on the left, which is kind of important because it's actually one man facing another man. They're in conversation, and then you have the young boys in the right side, and they're newspaper salespeople. And so you've got all this sort of activity, this street activity going on, but there's this wonderful man just posing, and he looks so fashionable. And then he also did some dock workers. So these on the right of this page, you've got the coal dock workers and two coal dock workers, and then a close-up of the one. And I think he really renders people sensitive, although I don't think that was his intention. He doesn't seem to care so much, but he ends up photographing them in a sensitive way. But Dorothea Lange is more concerned with that than he is. So another book that he got involved with, or another sort of photo shoot, he went to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and photographed this graveyard and steel mill, which ends up being published in a book called The Land of the Free by Archibald MacLeish. And it appears in other things as well. But if I've seen other pictures that he took at this moment, and the way this one's positioned with the cross looking big, you know it's about death. And then you associate the lines of the telephone going from the homes to the factories, and you make that connection between maybe what's going on at the factories could be causing death. We don't know. But I think he makes those connections. And it's just a good photograph no matter what. I mean, that cross really big in contrast to the background. This project ends up being something that's quite well known. He worked with a writer called James Agee, and initially they were to go down to the South to interview and photograph tenant farmers, and it was supposed to be for Fortune magazine. That project fell through, but they kept doing it anyway, and so he made a number of photographs. They interviewed the people, and this was published in a book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, published in 1941, and it was an extremely well-received book. And the picture of Allie Mae Burroughs, the sharecropper's wife on the left, is just, just kind of a perfect portrait of this moment, because you see that sort of the stripped down shingles in the back that she's set up against, and the way she's biting her lip. It is very indicative of someone who is stressed, but she wants to cooperate. She wants to help with the photo shoot. And then I'll just end here with Walker Evans to show you where he goes in the 1940s. And this is one of his own projects, as far as I know. It was started in 1941. It's his Subway series, where he's kind of shooting undercover. What I mean, he's hiding his camera because he wants to catch people that are not aware that they're being photographed. And this is right when America is going to war in World War II. So Dorothea Lange, she is another person who was hired by the FSA, and she has a very sympathetic interest in the human figure and human conditions. She grew up on the East Coast. She contracted polio at the age of 7, which left her with a limp in the right leg. She tried hard to compensate. Her father left the family when she was 12, and there's bitter memories of that time. She ended up taking lessons from Clarence White School of Photography before traveling west to San Francisco with a girlfriend. All their money was stolen upon arriving in San Francisco, but she managed to get jobs in photo studios. Apprenticed with Arnold Genthe, the famous San Francisco photographer, who was famous for his pictorial style and photographs of Chinatown. And she began in her own studio initially as a portraitist trained in the pictorialist aesthetic, but she soon moved to photograph people in compromising positions and their social situations. So we're familiar with this white angel bread line. So we see a lot of men waiting in line for handouts, for food, or for some kind of compensation. Most of them are facing forward. Only this one man who is leaning against the fence, and here he has that tight look on his face, that his lips are pursed, and he does look a little tired and haggard, and his hat is quite dirty and kind of wrinkled compared to everybody else's hat. And it's framed really nicely with the fence on the bottom. So this is an early photograph. She saw this man from the balcony of her studio, and this kind of was a turning point for Dorothea Lange. So she goes on the road, so to speak. She's photographing for the California, the government, the California Rural Relief Project, photograph migratory workers. So here we have a damaged child, Shacktown, Oklahoma, and this one appears in the famous Family of Man exhibition in MoMA in the 1950s. Ditched, stalled, and stranded. I mean, we really see the fear in this man's eyes. So, under very difficult conditions. Migratory cotton picker, Eloy, Arizona. Lange often focused on people's hands and legs because she knew a disability, and for some reason she wanted to photograph the way people supported themselves and were able to work through their limbs. And of course we know about the migrant mother. This was where she had been driving along a highway, and she saw a sign that said Pea Pickers Camp, and she ignored it. And she went down the highway 20 odd miles, and something was nagging at her to turn around and go back, and she did. And she took 5 photographs, and this is the one, because it's got the Madonna and child look. There's the babe in her arms, and the 2 children that are turned, sort of forming this triangle. It's the photograph that Roy Stryker said was the most important one of the FSA. She too was involved in making a book. She co-authored a book with her then husband, Paul Taylor. It was called An American Exodus, and it consists of interviews with the people that she photographed. So this one is migratory family traveling across the desert, Roswell, New Mexico. And all they have is sort of a wheelbarrow to carry the littlest one on. Very difficult times. And I mentioned to you before that I wanted you to remember the one man behind the plow because I thought, oh, this is an interesting comparison. Hers is taken not sort of on an angle, but going straight across, and we see this just plowing this awful ground that looks like it wouldn't produce anything. So, and he's plowing it with one mule, not a team of horses. So Dorothea Lange worked for the FSA, the Farm Securities Administration, and then as America went to war, then new organizations were started by the government, and she photographed for the Office of War Information. She did that with Ansel Adams. This one's called End of the Shift. It's at a shipbuilder's factory as the men are leaving or switching their shifts. So in Richmond, California. And you notice the focus on the legs. And then when America does go to war after Pearl Harbor, then there's the War Relocation Authority, and that's when they round up Japanese Americans living in the Bay Area, and they were sent to internment camps. So she said this was the most difficult assignment of her career, and she did this for a year and a half. And those photographs were sequestered for about 50 years. Most of them did not, well, really they did not, they were more released more recently for the public view. Margaret Bourke-White. So Margaret Bourke-White was not part of the FSA per se, but she ended up doing one project during the Depression, which we'll talk about, and I just wanted you to get a little sense of who Bourke-White was. All the people we've been looking at today, their work ends up in print media. It's they're either in magazines, mostly magazines, and Bourke-White is no exception. So we see her here being photographed by her assistant. She's out on the gargoyle in the Chrysler building in New York City, where she actually has a studio for a brief time in the 1930s. So Bourke-White has a sort of a long career going to college. It takes her about 6 schools before she gets her degree, but she does get her degree, and she does take some classes with Clarence White down the line. So he's an important person passing on traditions of photography. In the end, after graduation, she moves to Cleveland, where her mother was living at the time, and so she's really interested in the flats, as they're called, where the factories are down by the river, and so she photographs there. And then what you see here is this big industrial shapes, but in the back is the terminal tower, and that's where her first studio ends up being. So she works there for a while and photographs a lot of industry. And photographing industry just becomes a passion for her. And so here she photographs at the Chrysler factory in Detroit. And so her photographs of industry come about in a number of ways, but one was that she wanted to photograph the making of steel. So she talked her way into photographing the steel making plant, Otis Steel, in Cleveland. She talked her way in there. The man didn't want her in there, but he agreed while he was on vacation she could photograph the making of steel. So she did that early on, and those photographs ended up being in the stockholders' book and ended up being published, and they were seen by Robert Luce, look at the right name here, who he started Fortune magazine, and then he started Life magazine. So Luce invited Bourke-White to come to New York for an interview, and he hired her the first photographer on staff. In fact, she got the first cover of the first Life magazine, and this is what you're looking at here. So this was taken Fort Peck Dam, Montana, 1936. And it shows American industry. You see small men next to the dam, but it's really just to show scale. It shows how grand and wonderful American ingenuity and industry is. And so it's meant to boost America's spirit in the middle of this depression. So she starts a long, about a 20-year career working for Life magazine. Here's another one from Fort Peck Dam. Again, she shows industry, I think, in a beautiful way. I mean, we see the lines of the industry, and then you see the man, but it gives you a sense of scale. But the design of industry looks interesting. This one appeared in Life magazine too. It was the Louisville flood, and this one kind of is gives you a sense of her working attitude when she saw these people. They're in a bread line, they're waiting for food, but everybody was faced in the opposite direction. So she talked this whole line into everyone facing, going left to right, because it makes more sense. You read you read the background left to right, you read the text left to right, so it works perfect having the people standing left to right. And anyway, this one, as I said, appeared in Life magazine, 1937. This was the book that she did with Erskine Caldwell, and they went down to the South to interview sharecroppers and people's situation during the drought, during the Depression. And their book ends up being one of the most popular, her and Erskine Caldwell. It's called You Have Seen Their Faces. The text was not directly interviewing the people, however, the text was written by Caldwell. So it's not like accurate, but it's accurate enough. And so here we see a couple, and apparently, as I said, the text comes from Caldwell. It says, "A man learns not to expect much." And then they came upon this prison chain gang, and this is one of the interesting stories about Dorothea Lange. She ends up jumping in the ditch so she can take a good close-up of these guys because of inhumane treatment, and the guard is very upset and starts shooting after them, and so they have to hop in the car and take off. And then this one boy and his dog Blackie kind of, well, for a number of reasons, makes you feel something. You see this house is papered in journal print, paper from journals, paper from Life magazine. It's very poor living conditions, and here he is, this little boy with his dog, and they've almost got the same look on their faces, kind of weary, kind of nervous. And I'm just going to show you these really quickly because it's kind of beyond our time frame, but Bourke-White continues to work for Life magazine. She's on the forefront of World War II. Here she's in Moscow photographing the bombing of Moscow, which went on for a month every night straight in 1941. She ends up being assigned with General Patton, and they go in and liberate Buchenwald concentration camp. So she took a few photographs at this point, and she wrote and illustrated the book Dear Fatherland that discusses her experience in Germany toward the end of World War II. She also goes on to be involved in photographing in India, and that's in 1947 when India gains independence from Britain, and the country is divided into two countries, India and Pakistan. And she photographs Gandhi at this moment. And then for Life magazine, Bourke-White photographs the difficult conditions for diamond and gold miners in Africa. Somebody that we've heard about and is an important photographer, and we saw her work when you went down to the Art Institute and we were looking at the 1930s photographers. She wasn't per se in the FSA, but she was in a branch, and it was a WPA, Works Progress Administration, that supported this book that she made photographs for called Changing New York, and Berenice Abbott took pictures of the growth of New York, the change in the buildings, and so that becomes an important project. Before that, she moved to Paris in the early 20s, and she started working as an assistant to Man Ray. Through that, she ended up meeting Eugene Atget, the documentarian of Paris. She photographed him in this portrait shortly before he died, and she bought a number of his works and brought them back to the U.S., so sort of saving them from obscurity. So she sort of helped promote Atget's work in America. This is the Daily News building from Changing New York. This was a federal arts project. And I still don't know how, she must have really figured out which buildings to go up into to get these really interesting points of view. And then she did just ground kind of street scenes of stores, and I think that gives you a whole sense of what it was like at that moment and that time. And this is the Blossom Restaurant. And this is underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. But she has a different point of view again. You're seeing some of the skyline of Manhattan and then sort of local warehouse types. This sort of looks like an Edward Hopper, but in photography. And then this is called Horse in Lincoln Square, which sort of reminds you of maybe a surrealist photograph, because it's sort of random. It's not like she's been concerned with what is inside the frame. You see people moving outside the frame, so it is sort of that idea of surrealism, which I'm sure she picked a little of that up with her association with Man Ray. Just going to show you two more people, just a brief introduction to them, because they're important, but just for time's sake, we'll just give an introduction. One was Esther Bubbly, and Esther Bubbly was definitely, she worked for the FSA by wartime had become the Office of War Information, and so she worked for that organization. She went on buses around the country to see what people were doing. She not followed women, but she interviewed women in boarding houses, because women were brought into the city and other places of manufacturing to work in the factories when the men were off at war. And so she interviewed these and photographed these women in boarding houses. This particular project you see right here was for Standard Oil, and then this one shows two women in boarding houses during World War II. So her work ends up being in a lot of print media, a lot of magazines, and she's a very interesting photographer that you might delve into further. Gordon Parks as well. He began photographing with the FSA when its emphasis shifted to wartime. He was in the group Office of War Information, and this is in the textbook, and it's quite a wonderful photograph of a cleaning woman named Ella Watson, and Ella Watson's job was to clean the FSA office, and this one has also been referred to as the American Gothic, and I think it's a very strong portrait. You've got the American flag in the background, but you also see the tools of her trade. So a very sensitive image. And then Gordon Parks shows you women employed in the factories. So they're looking very powerful. They're looking very confident. And it's kind of a real tribute to the women who are supporting the war. So that's the end of our 1930s into the early 40s, and we've got one more lesson to go. Be back shortly.